Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the launch presentation of Future Art Ecosystems 2, Art and the Metaverse. We will get that right at some point. From now on, we will refer to this throughout the presentation as Faye 2. I am Kay Watson.
And I'm Victoria Vinova.
And we are part of the Serpentine Arts Technologies team. And here beyond this Twitch frame are our really dear colleagues Alex Boyes, Tamar Clark-Brown, Ava Yeager, Ralph Pritchard, and Florence Creffield.
Yeah, you're missing Ben Vickers,
I am missing
who is
someone.
not here, but we do believe that he's with us in spirit. So just a few words about this format. We decided to test out something a little bit different to Zoom, and in the spirit of Faye 2, we really hope you enjoy this presentation. So let us know your thoughts, but please be kind. It is our first time.
So what is going to be happening tonight is that we're going to walk you through Faye 2, and we're going to explain the key concepts and the motivations for putting them forward. But to caveat, we won't be able to cover absolutely everything tonight, but we will try and cover as many of those core concepts as we can. If you haven't done so already, you can download Faye 2 here from our website, futureartecosystems.org. Also, hopefully right now, Alex, our colleague, will have dropped a link into the chat for a digital goodie bag, which includes images of the diagrams that are part of the briefing that you can include as part of your operational agendas for 21st century cultural infrastructure, as well as Telegram emojis, screensavers, and phone wallpaper. So feel free at any point to use the chat, put your questions and your comments into the chat. If you can't see it, you may need to log in. You should be able to see it, but to be able to interact, you will need to log in. So our all-knowing colleague Alex, who's to our side here, will either respond directly via the chat, or otherwise we will try and respond to questions at the end. We also have BSL throughout this presentation by the wonderful Sarah Meeks, and we also have closed captions. Is that everything?
I think so. So let's get into it. Faye 2. Whoops, we're not at the beginning.
We need to start at the beginning.
Let's start at the beginning. That's always a good place. Okay, so Faye 2 was produced in collaboration with Rival Strategy, Marta and Benedict. Rival Strategy is a studio that helps organizations evolve their strategic imaginations and operations. And in fact, it was together with Rival Strategy that we conceived of Future Art Ecosystems as an annual strategic briefing 2 years ago to do precisely that, to help or to articulate references, concepts, and various kind of key frameworks for the construction of the 21st century cultural infrastructure that is necessary in order to support the production, dissemination, management, and financialization of art that engages with advanced technologies and touches on important or engages with important societal issues.
So this time also for Faye 2, we worked with an additional guest producer, and that is Luke Casper Pearson. He is the co-founder of the design research practice UNP, and he runs the video game urbanism studio at the Bartlett, where they are researching the use of game technologies to engage new audiences with the processes that shape cities and prototype new futures. Now, because this year's issue focuses on the metaverse, and there will obviously be more of that to come, the development of which is currently driven by game technologies, we thought that this would be a really important perspective to have part of the production team in considering the potential ways that cultural organizations are to approach the possibilities and risks of this space.
But before we get to the metaverse, we'd like to thank our many contributors for their time, wisdom, and expertise, and in particular, Jayan Lopez and Lucy Rose Solid for organizing 2 incredible closed roundtables. We also thank our advisors, Evaya Legetov, Sofia Netjaev, Gabriel de la Puente of the White Pube, and Katrina Sluis for also granting their wisdom and expertise, and to Ava Yeager, who's here, and Roxy Tsayer for the incredible visuals that accompany Faye 2, and last but not least, Sarah Shin for editing this year's publication.
So if any of you are willing, present, able, please do say hi in the chat. We'd love to hear from you, and Alex will certainly say hi back. So in addition, before we really start, we also have 10 copies of this printed book to give away to anyone, to the first 10 people who can provide the closest answer to the number of times we use the word infrastructure, infrastructures, or infrastructural in Phase 2. We will get back to the lucky recipients if you pop your answers in the chat, and we will reach out to you if you are close.
So, the metaverse. Now, full disclosure, we were not completely sure about utilizing this term when we started our research process. While we were interested in exploring the technologies that are driving the development of increasingly complex and sophisticated virtual worlds, we found that the term metaverse was a little bit suspect, or at least that was the impression that we got from the initial interviews. And in fact, there was a diverse array of reactions to that term. So as I said, some found it suspect or even distasteful to a certain extent. Some found it irrelevant or as a distant sci-fi reference from a bygone era, and others have not even heard of it. Yet there were also some that thought that it was an interesting term to use precisely because of its slipperiness and the fact that it can be utilized as let's say, a good, interesting narrative device in driving investment into a certain set of technologies that are kind of at the heart of developing the space about which we're going to talk about.
So, as Victoria has just said, there is currently, we're in this moment where there is a surge of investment into the technologies that will underwrite the construction of a metaverse or the metaverses. This is in part driven by the vision of the games industry. And for this, you can refer, on a very top level, high level, to the mission of people like Tim Sweeney of Epic Games or Herman Narula at Improbable, who makes Spatial OS. Now, we enter the picture here. So while this is a highly ambitious endeavour, we do think it's a good moment for the public sector to step into this conversation, given that these commercial drivers are sort of portraying these new systems as open, transparent and accountable, and for there to be a dialogue to ensure that this is the case as these systems are built up.
So let's define the metaverse, and this is for the uninitiated, and I must admit that I was one of them at the start of this research process. So here is a definition of the metaverse that is effectively an aggregate or a summary of all definitions that are out there, and it builds on something that Matthew Ball has captured in one of his many articles. So Matthew Ball is a VC and somebody who tracks the development of the space quite closely, writes about accessible language, is also described as an elite media analyst, so make of that what you will. But in any case, so the metaverse refers to a digital layer that is spatial and 3D, real-time, shared with multiple concurrent users, persistent, meaning that it continues to exist and evolve even when users aren't interacting with it, inherently hybrid, that is layered and integrated between virtual and physical, but perceived as a single reality, interoperable, a term to which we will return a number of times, it is really at the heart of this huge infrastructural project. In this context, it means that, or some of the ways in which it could be interpreted, that it is possible to exchange assets, carry over avatars and value, as in move through as economic agents between seamlessly connected worlds. And also generates economies that can merge with and influence the larger global economy.
So ultimately what we're talking about is, we're talking about the future of the internet as we know it. So the basic building block of the metaverse that is probably most familiar to everyone today is what we in the report call an advanced virtual environment. This is generally associated with video games or game worlds, and for very good reason, because they are built with those same tools. And at the real core of this is the video game engine. For those of you who are unfamiliar, and perhaps this is really obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, this is the software with which we build video games and game worlds. So these software environments act as a hub for creating the visuals, audio, mechanics, lots of different things of these advanced virtual environments. In addition, the most well-known of these, which are Unity and Unreal Engine, are available to use through flexible licensing arrangements and therefore mostly for free. Now, we could dedicate an entire event just to this subject alone, which I would love, but we will keep this brief. In recent years, this technology is everywhere. from CGI and film and TV productions to simulations for scientific research to town planning, industrial design, architecture. The infrastructure of the games industry is now part of the digital functionality of many different sectors in society. So we draw particular attention to this technology in this report because it already allows for a lot of the features that Victoria has listed as part of our sort of definition of the metaverse. So the capability to create real-time 3D interactive spatial environments with multiple users and increasingly complex economies such as those that we find in massive multiplayer online worlds. We then combine this with other emerging and enabling technologies such as cloud computing, 5G, GPU is something I've never heard of, and so on. Some of these properties properties of the visions of the metaverse are already here, and some are 5, 10 further away. But regardless, these are increasingly being sort of integrated into mainstream societal infrastructure. And then if we go back to the game engine, what's interesting is that this technology, this game engine, is potentially functioning as an interface layer to what we're calling the metaverse stack.
So let's rein it back in, into the context of cultural institutions. I mean, the key takeaway here for cultural organizations is that the notion of digital is shifting from the somewhat familiar terrain of Web 2.0, platform-based social media, social web terrain. And not only is it no longer possible to speak of physical and digital as separate realms, if it ever was, but the idea that digital is a tool for mirroring or amplifying what happens within gallery walls, or a medium for artworks that follow a white cube model, logic becomes apparently very limiting. Now, we got a glimpse of that in the pandemics, during the pandemic months, when physical sites of cultural organizations were shut, and it became apparent that the framework for digital strategy that has existed to date, and there are of course exceptions, so we're talking kind of about the lowest common denominator, so to speak, but the conception of digital strategy as something that drives traffic onto the site, as something that amplifies what happens within gallery walls, doesn't really work. It also doesn't really work if we consider digital as a medium for a certain type of art that is presented within a white cube model paradigm. So what is the white cube model paradigm?
So let's go to the white cube model diagram.
29.
Oh, it's not the diagram.
No, it's the list.
It's the list.
It's the list.
So this is how we're defining the white cube model here. And, we're using this in the context of talking about delivering the mission of arts institutions around physical space. So we're looking at these 3 principles, which are, number 1, that presented objects are unique and finalized. Number 2, that these objects are presented to a general anonymous viewership. And number 3, that a specially configured physical space is the hosting environment of those presented objects or artworks.
Now, of course, there's a very literal way in which you could take these 3 parameters and translate them into a digital twin scenario. So this is the logic of the online viewing room, which has surfaced during the pandemic months once again. And while it may have a place in a certain kind of niche of the art market that is dedicated to a certain type of art, it doesn't seem like the most fruitful avenue to follow for cultural organizations that have, usually more ambitious public missions to represent the interests of society, to support artists, to track developments that are impacting societies at large and intervene into these developments. So for that reason, we proposed an alternative model for conceptualizing digital strategy, although probably digital strategy is also kind of a term that we need to lose. But this is sort of sufficiently, I would say, kind of not necessarily speculative, but sort of first iteration suggestion, which means that it isn't something that we're kind of suggesting as the final solution to everything, but only as a starting point. So UX of art, user experience of art, as a strategic approach to an increasingly hybrid reality where, as I mentioned before, you can no longer really make a distinction between physical and digital, and so you need to kind of operate from a presumption that you live in a hybridized reality, and that hybridized reality requires the organization to rethink the principles upon which decisions around investment happen. So
let's have a look at what sort of this shift that's happening as through the lens of the advanced virtual environment. So we'll just go to one of the diagrams in the publication, and I'll just zoom in a little bit.
It's both a diagram and a list.
It's a diagram and a list, which
it's
is very used, a hybrid list. So what we're seeing is this shift, or what we may see is this shift towards an experience that evolves and progresses rather than something that is always necessarily finite. If we look at the second coupling here under UX of art, we've really been thinking about who the users of cultural institutions are. So, I mean, there has definitely been a push in recent years to segment audiences in order to understand them better. However, I mean, there's always often a presumption that the only users are the ones that enter the gallery space rather than the artists themselves or other communities that any given organisation serves as a result of its location, its areas of specialisation or its wider positioning. And then if we look to the final point, we're really thinking about the sort of hosting potential here. So in terms of like the mission of arts organisations working with technologies, that would mean sort of deeper integration with these kinds of production processes that are necessary to sort of engage those users and key stakeholders.
So, this is a diagram. It is a diagram, which kind of puts forward the key ideas around UX of art, namely that organizational decision making should be based around the key stakeholder groups, so the users, and the delivery of the public mission. Now, then there's kind of a choice around decisions of investment and commitment in terms of the capabilities that any organization would like to develop or to progress, depending on the type of function that it needs to serve within a wider societal fabric. And that kind of goes back to the public mission and the user. Now, to make those ideas a little bit less abstract and more grounded, we offer two examples here. So at the top here, we've got an organization that might have a mission to support artists working with advanced technologies. So it would make sense for it to invest into R&D and into production processes in order to be able to support artists in producing new art forms. Now, another organization that has more of a commitment towards kind of critical discourse around art and advanced technologies might invest into a different type of R&D and also curating and convening in order to be able to deliver formal and informal exchange of knowledge between different communities, sectors, organizations, etc. Now, we realize that these are somewhat reductive, and probably most organizations will have hybridized versions of these. But I think what we wanted to emphasize with UX of art is that it allows for institutions to become much more specific about what they want to achieve, understanding their audiences and understanding their role in society vis-a-vis their public mission. So this is what we call kind of a capabilities-led organization. And when we move on to the next part in a few minutes, it will become apparent why capabilities-led organizations are a really kind of core unit of future art ecosystems.
So before we do that, it's really important to say that supporting artistic experimentation with advanced technologies is really the key or the core of why we're here. So therefore, what we're pointing to is the need for more integration with artistic production processes and access to diverse dissemination and business models, which is really difficult for organisations to provide in terms of providing this systemic support for these kinds of practices. So as part of the process of working on Phase 2 over the last year, we've been speaking to a number of practitioners and organisations in adjacent fields, including blockchain, gaming, film and architecture, which we refer to here
a diagram
as our adjacency, and we have another diagram. And the purpose of this was in order to understand the opportunities and challenges that lie in those sectors that are engaging with this shift in the digital condition that is the metaverse, and to understand what infrastructure and work there is taking place, in particular how they might be supporting emerging hybrid and experimental practices. Now, we only have time to look at 2 of the 4 that we mention here. But I think the obvious place to start is indie games, which is ultimately the genesis of the games industry as we know it today, and an incredibly interesting area of cultural production where risk-taking and experimentation is taking place. So that is obviously not to say that this industry is a utopia, it is not, but there are a number of business models available to cultural producers that are supported by direct-to-consumer publishing platforms, the access to a multiplicity of tools such as game engines and many others, financial mechanisms such as Kickstarter and Patreon and Ko-Fi, as well as a number of policies such as video games tax relief. So this, combined with the ability to create social and economic relationships with communities via early access, testing, streaming, like we are here today, and so on, that enable large-scale user engagement with all of these elements and combine to create what is a very interesting ecosystem. So the second, slightly different, is the film industry. So we're not talking about the high-end film, virtual production that we've seen so much of recently, and the very famous example of that is The Mandalorian, but a particular focus on what is now known as immersive storytelling. Now, this is a genre that I would say has emerged from film festivals and the related lab and incubator programs, and is a nascent economy in its own right, particularly all over the place, but it's particularly in the UK. This is not just a new film style or a type of art, as it could appear, but an area that exists because it's been supported by the creation of infrastructures for production and dissemination that have been built onto existing infrastructures of the film industry and festival circuit. So we can point to Sundance and the New Frontier program that launched in 2007, which was one of the first. And this has now moved into areas like CPH Docs and the Labs, Sheffield Doc Fest, BFI London Film Festival, and many more who have invested in this area of experimentation, creating networks, knowledge transfer and distribution potential for artists and creative practice with metaverse technologies. So while these adjacent fields obviously offer commercial, developmental and civic, if we're talking about particularly about architecture, opportunities for artists experimenting with these advanced technologies, something we're really keen to point to, it's not, we're not talking about grass is greener on the other side, is how these are still fragmented and of course largely commercially driven, whereas we feel that for an accountable, transparent evolution of this space, that artistic and experimental visions need additional avenues of support.
Indeed. So this is where we see the traditional cultural organizations potentially serving an important role. And as we have described just a few minutes ago, kind of turning towards a more capabilities-led development of organizations is sort of one part of that piece. The other part is, of course, policy-driven, because the scale of intervention that's required in order to pull this off and to pull it off well is significant. So in Phase 1, we have pointed to a lack of infrastructural prototyping in the public cultural sector, whereas individual artists and also the tech industry have been quite good at doing this infrastructural prototyping, specifically in this art and advanced technologies area. So what we propose with Phase 2 are a series of vectors for kickstarting the necessary infrastructural prototyping in order to be kind of an impactful and relevant contributor towards the construction of 21st century cultural infrastructure. And we've spoken a lot about production capabilities, because that's a really obvious gap in the field. And we feel strongly that investing in advanced production capabilities is something that has to happen in order for the traditional cultural organizational sector to retain a significant role in building future art ecosystems. But we recognize this is something that can't just stem from the initiation of individual organizations, or let's say the only organizations that be able to initiate this on their own are the very big organization, which isn't really the most ideal way for the sector as a whole to evolve. For this reason, we want to show an example of something
Yes, we do.
that might kind of point us in the direction of a less competition-driven and more what we call kind of interoperable way of investing into infrastructures.
So obviously there haven't been a huge amount of examples, but we will have a few in this section here. This is Dream, which is this example of advanced production capabilities together with interoperability. So it was a live virtual production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that combined the latest gaming and theatre technology to create a shared experience between audiences, performers and actors. So the project was a result of a major piece of R&D work that was supported by the Audiences of the Future programme, which was UK Research and Innovation funding through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So many, I knew I was going to be able to say that right, which in total invested just over £39 million into a number of projects that developed work with sort of cutting edge work with immersive technologies. So for Dream, 15 specialist organisations led by the Royal Shakespeare Company in collaboration with Manchester International Festival, Marshmallow Laser Feast and the Philharmonia Orchestra brought together expertise in theatre, performance, video production, the music industry, gaming and research to explore what it means to perform live using technologies such as VR, AR and mixed reality, and how this is shared with audiences. What's happening here is that there was a development of cutting-edge technologies and capabilities taking place together as part of a consortium.
So that's interoperability at the level of advanced production capabilities, but there are also... Would you like to do it this time?
Okay,
go for it. But there are also a few other ways in which we can think about interoperability. I actually wanted the diagram, okay?
Oh, sorry, I got it wrong.
No, don't worry. Which page was it again? It was 93. 1 second, everything is under control. Okay, so this diagram, it tries to represent a notion of interoperability between organizations from the perspective of the user. And let's assume that in this case, the user is an artist working with advanced technologies. So from their perspective, having kind of a more seamless experience where you can work with different organizations that are each kind of leaders within the functions that they deliver, such as producing engaging experiences to audiences, or producing societal resources that are then redeployed by other organizations, or helping and supporting artists to produce experimental artworks, or equally kind of plugging in artistic practices into wider knowledge exchange projects and programs, like at a significantly important scale. So that's another way in which we conceive of interoperability. So we just wanted to make sure that we aren't focusing exclusively on advanced production capabilities. And for that reason, Kay will show another example where you can see this from a slightly different angle.
Very happy to show this example. So at this point, this is a very different project to what we've shown before. This is SPUR. This is a residency and mentorship and support program that was developed in direct response to the pandemic, supporting graduates working collaboratively online. It was produced by Chaos Magic, OMPS Social Club and D-Unit with a number of other partners, including university partners, and taking place in a platform developed by OMSC. We share this not only because it's really great, and the virtual worlds created by the residents were brilliant, but it points to collaboration to undertake a specific mission in which the artist is the key user, audience or stakeholder, or whatever we're going to call it, as well as a number of different roles that are going to be necessary. So as we've already mentioned, the UX of art. Let me find, hopefully this is the right page. Yes. UX of Art proposes a view on how cultural institutions serve different user communities from the perspective of individual organisations, policy and funders. The UX of Art both includes everyone with whom any given organisation interacts and also seeks greater precision in understanding who these user communities are. How that is then supported infrastructurally will enable deeper engagement with users as stakeholders, which is the terminology we use in the report. And this includes the skills and knowledge that underwrite the ability to facilitate this kind of artistic experimentation with advanced technologies. So we're not just talking about production again, just to repeat, but for curating, archiving, collecting, presentation, hosting, and more operational and community management positions and so on within cultural institutions. So in addition, oh yes, I have a very long monologue here.
Indeed, but it's all connected.
It's all connected. So in addition, what is clear is that for a genuinely diverse 21st century cultural infrastructure and ecosystem of organisations, we do require a more diverse range of economic and distribution models than those that are currently available. So we have been looking at economic models in virtual worlds, whether this is the type of closed world systems that you find in specific MMOs like EVE Online, and we just love to show this because I love the picture. Or the more decentralized vision of value distribution and user agency that is fueled by the blockchain industry. So we talk about this in the book, but we'll just talk about it again. Decentraland is an example that we look to here, though there are so many others, of course, but just to stick to one. In Decentraland, users develop and own plots of land, artwork, and NFTs, while members also participate in the platform's decentralized autonomous organization to be part of the governance of that virtual world. So we're also talking about governance strategies as well. In addition, if we start to talk about distribution, we can also point again to the video games industry, in which there are obviously a number of different kinds of platforms and strategies in which creators and producers are able to get their work to audiences. So we have platforms like itch.io, to the sort of more proprietary platforms, App Store, Google Play Store, and so on. So what these platforms do are, is very obvious, are creating opportunities to share that work directly.
So I think it's important to point out that we're not suggesting to copy-paste or to import all of these models into the art field. But nonetheless, it is important to understand how the art-adjacent fields, as we call them, propel artistic practices in the metaverse, whether it's indie game studios, crypto art, professional gaming, or new hybrid practices that bridge traditional fields and this new technological space. So from the perspective of cultural institutions, there is also a lack of recognition that the various functions that these organizations can serve, the ones that we describe in those wheel diagrams, are actually functions that they can serve. And they are, in fact, perhaps already serving in embryonic form. In order for that recognition to become apparent, and in order for it to become actively developed and invested into, and basically a commitment that organizations can follow through, it is necessary to kind of rethink the systems of measurement that help organizations, and help, I think, is an important word rather than hold accountable, but help organizations, right, develop themselves into more capabilities-led organizations. So with this in mind, I think we can say that when we talk about the cultural sector here, we don't necessarily mean it as an industrial sector, but rather as a space from which you can intervene and synthesize at the intersection of culture in the broad sociological sense and technological and economic development. So with kind of this definition of 21st century cultural infrastructure and understanding that we need a new set of metrics or a new system of measurement, we will be dedicating Phase 3, Future Art Ecosystems, to this precise matter. So this final chapter of Phase 2 is sort of a rough draft or a proposal that we'd like to discuss with all of you that we want to get feedback on, be challenged on, etc. So we're very much looking forward to that in the next year, and that will be part of our research process.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important to say that Future Art Ecosystems is an ongoing process. So we are really keen to speak to anyone who is interested in this area, is currently working in this area, because I know that there are lots of you, or would like to sort of participate in research taking place in this area. So in the meantime,
the short term,
in
the short term,
there is a variety of additional program that we'd really like to share with you that's taking place in the next 3 months. First of all, we have 2 special editions podcasts called Playtesting that are presented by our wonderful Tamar Clark-Brown and produced with Reduced Listening, that are coming out this Friday, focusing on counter-archive, intergenerational and co-creation models in this space. So please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Also, we have a program of workshops in collaboration with the first of which will be led by Daniel Brathwaite-Shirley at the end of this month. We also have others with Kaikin and Christopher McInnes, so please do look for those. And we also have a series of artist talks called Future Ecosystems Live with Sam Rolfs, Amelia Winger-Bearskin, Larry Champong and David Blandy, and Robin McNicholas of Marshmallow Laser Feast, many of whom are all contributors to the FAE2 publication. In addition, and we like to do these plugs, you can also sign up to our newsletter at futureecosystems.org.
Yes. We won't bombard you with newsletters once a month, usually, unless it's hot season like now. And also, finally, we will be releasing the Legal Lab Report 1 on legal issues that exist in art and tech and science collaborations. So this is a result of the research process that has taken place in the Legal Lab at Serpentine, led by Alana Kushner. And the report sort of dovetails with a lot of the questions that we discuss here, because obviously legal infrastructure is incredibly important in supporting artistic practices of the future. So the report will be launched on the 26th of July. If you'd like to join us for the launch event, it's at 11:30 a.m. Early, on the 26th of July, 11:30 a.m. London time.
Yep. British summer time.
So I think that is it. And I'm looking at Alex because he's the holder of the questions.
Questions.
Tell us
the questions, but first, I want to just do a quick shout out to Immersive because they sent through this great artwork today. I'm going to drop it in the chat.
Celebration.
That's commitment.
Yes,
thank you.
It is
It's more than
beautiful.
But
Not
true.
Not true. That's very.
That's a joke.
But to kick off the questions, and one that you both know so profusely, how much of the UX of art are you already responding to at Serpentine Gallery?
Oh, lovely question.
Lovely question. Do you want to take that up?
I'll take some of it. I think it's such a good question. So, where shall I start? I think something that's really important about what we're doing is that in this moment in time, that everyone's coming sort of through the pandemic. Obviously, we're still in it. We are like turning around and like looking inward and trying to understand better who our audiences are. So that is a really key thing that's happening across Serpentine. In some respects, in some parts of the program that's been happening for years. We can point to sort of the really interesting, like the really important processes that take place through our civic and education programs. But we are definitely like re-examining that sort of audience relationship. Anything else I should add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of capabilities focus is quite important.
Yeah.
And that's definitely, so this diagram is something that we are also applying to ourselves.
Yeah.
And just testing how that would pan out. So I guess we're in the process of it. I think these things take a lot of time, which is one of the reasons why FAE is an annual publication and is not meant to be some kind of final stamp on a certain set of affairs.
Yeah.
So in process,
and it will take time, as it will. All of this stuff will take time.
Next question: should we all just go digital? And what if we can't afford to?
I didn't mean to laugh at that so heartily, but no is the answer to the question. I think what we're trying to say is that we're not sort of fetishizing the tools of advanced technologies and digital we really are sort of looking at we're not prescribing that everyone move to advanced tech and specialize in this area. We're saying sort of a couple of different things, like the metaverse is coming. It is a digital condition which we all are going to have to deal with in some shape or form. We just don't necessarily know what yet. But what we're advocating for is like organizations to focus on really on their sort of capabilities and their functions, but for there to be more support at a policy level to sort of share those capabilities. Really, I think that's what we're saying more. It's really not about what an individual organization does. Of course that's important, but what we're trying to talk about this at like the sector level.
Absolutely. And I think at the level of individual organizations, I guess what we're advocating for is developing different approaches to the YQ model. And of course, this has been happening historically, but still somehow when it comes to metrics and when it comes to kind of communicating what cultural organizations do, we still tend to fall into the YQ model as the kind of norm that is applied across the sector and to all organizations. And I guess the first, let's say, kind of thing that needs to happen is for there to be a greater recognition of the diversity of outputs that organizations can produce, the diversity of value that they generate. That value needs to somehow be captured in a positive way. And so, yes, that's what we're saying. So the digital, I think, is the metaverse as a digital condition is more of trigger to really think about what this ecosystem is and how it should be organized.
Yeah.
Thank you. I can see Cade from New Design Congress is helping reply. So shout out to Cade as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question, and this one's a little bit more complicated and goes back to our diagrams.
Which one, Alex?
I'm assuming many of them. Have you explored more of these configurations of functions and capabilities and what they mean for organizations that choose those configurations? So I think this is the R&D configurations that we're
So can you repeat it again?
Capabilities and
Sure.
functions.
One more time. Have you explored more of these configurations of functions and capabilities and what they mean for organizations that choose those configurations?
I think it's a good question.
It's a good question. So
Yeah.
I think a lot of what we're describing here with this is somewhat, it's in part based on shifts of which we're aware within other organizations, but part of it is, it is a strategic briefing about a future that needs to be constructed. So most of it is actually not in place. And I think it would be actually a great research project to have a much more evidence-based, let's say, survey on how organizations decide to focus on specific capabilities and what that ultimately means for their, for the way that they function, for the way that they deliver on their mission. So, yes, that's a very good suggestion as to what needs to be done.
That came from our friends at Science Gallery International. Good question.
Thank you.
Next one, a little bit more philosophical.
That's for you.
That might be for you.
We love philosophy.
There are only humans online. Aren't we disconnecting from other species while migrating to the metaverse? What are the consequences of this?
Yeah.
Do you want to answer that?
What are the consequences of this?
Well, I think...
I thought I'd mix it up a little.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you, Alex. We love difficult questions. So whoever asked that. Potentially, yes. I think we also... there's an element of us sort of understanding our relationship to all of these different contexts. I think that we have to understand. And when we're sort of talking about a merging of physical and digital space, I guess other species, other entities are also part of that sort of merging of spaces. So in theory, no, I don't think we are. But it is a good question. It's not, I guess we've been thinking about this very kind of pragmatically, rather than sort of in that sort of way. But I do think that, of course, that is really valuable. it's just so interesting when you're in that sort of frame of mind of like, how do we organize, how do we produce and how do we organize and what's our financial model and all of this stuff, that you do sort of forget those sort of broader philosophical questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is clearly a broader environmental question around the metaverse. I mean, there are environmental questions around all organizational decision-making processes, right? All of them have some kind of environmental footprint. So there isn't, once again, talking about systems of measurement, this could be one of the vectors that is explored, right? How do we move towards a more multi-species, interspecies approach to organizational design in the context of like highly technologized condition of the metaverse? How do we for lack of a better word, kind of evaluate whether we are doing it, whether we're doing it well, etc. So yeah, thank you for raising that, and I think that's definitely something worth taking into account.
I think so, and also, when we're talking about any kind of systemic change, and that's what we're talking about, systemic change has to include all of these different sort of sides of what we want to change. We need to think about the climate emergency. We also need to think about, social justice and all of these points as well.
Another difficult question, well, not difficult, but this one's just popped in. I really like it. Is there any specific consideration for gender and race in this report, especially regarding UX experience?
Good question.
That is a very good question. Yeah.
It follows on, but just to finish it, wondering about this is typically the tech world, the adjacent industries discussed rely on data on the standard white male.
Yeah. No, it's totally true. And that's why we don't, we are obviously pointing to these adjacent fields, but we do not necessarily think these fields are necessarily sort of to be heralded as the sort of the pinnacle of how we should function on a sort of on many levels. And I think it comes back to this sort of point. We have this good quote from the Immersive Kind, and in terms of who is building this metaverse, who is it for, who's going to be represented in it, and that comes down to the fact that we have sort of a tech sector that is largely sort of a monoculture. And that is also part of the drive of us wanting to sort of insert cultural institutions and diverse, like a plurality of voices into these spaces. So I think it's definitely, like, it may not be sort of obvious when we're talking about it in the report, but I think it's like vital.
Absolutely. I mean, the diversity of like recognized aims within what organizations can pursue is a really important, it's an implicit way of getting to that, is that there are organizations that have very specific communities that they're dedicated to, and so they should have an opportunity to serve these communities to the best of their abilities and to receive adequate support on a policy level to do so. So I think that's one part of the question, and I was slightly kind of super organizational speak, but I think the problem with the white cube model is precisely what you point to. It's the fact that it is ultimately kind of based on a conception of an anonymous public figure that walks into the space and is of a particular kind, to enjoy what is on view. So our desire to shift away from the white cube model as kind of the core way in which we assess how decisions are made within organizations is to be able to prioritize other communities and groups of individuals or certain issues that organizations might want to pursue in a way that actually kind of evolves these practices rather than simply paying lip service to them. The data part is huge. So this, we had an ambition to do like a subsection on it, but then we realized that there's no way we can do justice to it, and this is going to be a really important priority in our research process for systems of measurement, because it is a really huge question. How do you strike a balance, as we say here, between kind of data-driven approaches to making decisions and organizational risk taking that was required for innovation, but also for exactly for the aim that you point to.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got a question here from an artist.
Great.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit.
Please.
If I'm an artist willing to develop work in VR and pretty ready to learn Unreal and tracking systems and so on, how do I find support and community and organizations that support it? Or do you have any practical tips?
Ooh, that's a lovely question. I mean, this is why ultimately we have been pointing in the adjacent fields to some of the stuff that's taking place in film, because there is a really sort of generous and sort of lively amount of work taking place, particularly around like Sheffield DocFest and CPH Docs and all of these different areas that sort of allows for sort of networking conversations and opportunities to meet people and potentially to get funding to do these kinds of projects. In addition, you have other places like, you know, we're working with Arbite this time around on our digital skills training sessions, and they've been on this sort of, but they've been doing this for a long time. So there's also those kinds of, you know, a number of different sort of small galleries that are able to provide these sort of skills sharing. But I mean, I do think that there is a need for more. Hence the report.
Yeah.
And, you know, we try and point to some of them, and, you know, I think it'd definitely be useful at some point to sort of collate all of those resources together to share, like, where are their opportunities.
Yeah.
But I think this is sort of the key, is that, you know, with production there really does need to be more support in this area. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe we'll pick it up when we speak to Sam Rolfs as well.
Oh yes, our first talk on the 29th of July, the Alex, the voice that you can hear, will be in conversation with Sam Rolfs on Twitch. Any comments? Any other questions?
I've got several questions here from Squizzy33, and one that I feel might lead into Phase 3. How are the needs and interests of stakeholders being measured and collected? In other words, how will arts organisations know/find out what stakeholders want?
I mean, that's the question.
That's the question.
Yeah.
So that's the question, but I think there is a lot of work that's being done around this, for example, by the Institute for Innovation Public Purpose at UCL. So that's exactly the question they posed around BBC, to kind of have a different paradigm for assessing the value that BBC brings to the larger media space, specifically from this position, because there are no frameworks that exist and that are implemented in policy right now, but these need to be developed in order for this value to be recognized, supported, and made use of in the correct way.
I'm going to ask you a question so I can give some resources to the chat. But from Frankie Does Twitch 00, what is Serpentine doing in terms of corporate sponsorship? The Serpentine has partnered with Google previously, for example. Why is this any different?
Thank you for that question. I was hoping that someone would ask us that question, if not knowing that someone would ask. And I think it's important to say that, you know, the tech industry is a huge part of our kind of societal infrastructure. So we don't want to pretend that that doesn't exist. I think what we're trying to say is to enable some kind of like leveling up between the public and the private sector. I think at the moment, and we sort of talk about this more in Phase 1, which is around sort of the tech industry as 21st century cultural art patron. And that kind of relationship is, because we're often competing for funds in cultural organisations, and that's cultural organisations and artists themselves are often competing for funds, that we sort of created this sort of imbalanced relationship. And I think finally, and you can probably speak more to this, is sort of a reconfiguring of what public and private partnerships can actually be. And I think that is something that's really important to think about as we move
Yeah.
forward.
And I think there is sort of a presumption that for art and tech, what you need is necessarily an art partner and a tech partner. And I guess what we're arguing for here is that you can have much more multi-layered and complex constellations of capabilities-led cultural public organizations, organizations from art adjacent fields, and tech industry. And I think when you have this sort of more multi-stakeholder paradigm of working together or figuring things out, the results are also different. And I think the ambitions can be different. And yeah, so I think that's the suggestion that we're making around this particular area of kind of public-private.
And it's understanding what those shared sort of aims and ambitions are. And I think, you know, we've done some brilliant projects with Google, and you know, we will continue to do those kinds of projects. I think it's, you know, every single partnership is completely different, and that's just sort of this sort of reconfiguration as we move forward into the metaverse is just something we need to consider.
Next question from Les Moore. Do you feel that institutional support has expanded artistic practice online, or more insisted on a small canon and set of practices?
I think it's a very general question.
I don't know if I know the answer to that one. Sorry, ask that again. Sorry.
One more time.
Sorry. It's late. It's been a long day.
It is. Do you feel that institutional support has expanded artistic practice online, or more insisted on a small canon and set of practices?
What's that? What practices? Specific canon of what practices? I just didn't hear the word.
A small canon and set of practices.
A set of practices, okay.
It's difficult to say. I think that there's probably a mixture of both things happening, actually, because it really depends what organisations and sort of what we're talking about here. I guess, you know, maybe we do see, you know, there are certain scenes or, you know, artists that are more visible, and that creates a certain kind of...
through institutional support, you mean?
Through institutional support, yes. And through opportunity. But it's a difficult question. I don't know if I know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to kind of give an overarching answer.
Yeah.
I guess if we had to be kind of true to the word, and now in Faye too, right?
Yeah.
We'd say that although there have been fragmented instances of where this kind of expansion happened, and I guess this kind of institutional support of the kind that Kay just spoke is one example. In general, the predominance of the white cube model has meant that perhaps that support wasn't as extensive as it could have been if different alternative forms of support and you know, providing developmental opportunities were explored. So that's what we're advocating for, I guess. It's sort of for there being a greater diversity of ways in which organizations can work with artists, and that needs to be understood on both sides. Yes, it's not just, I think, the organization's place, but it's also it's kind of it's a mutual.
Yeah, it's an interesting
desire.
question though. So thank you, whoever asked that question.
We've only got 2 minutes left.
Yes.
So, how do you envision encouraging interoperability between organizations without sharing financial or data resources?
Policy.
Yeah.
I think that's the key. I think that's very key here, is that policy has to encourage that interoperability. What do you think?
I think exactly that. And I'm just lazily scrolling to the part where we talk about it.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it seems like an easy cop out to say, oh, yeah, just policy.
Yeah,
it's not our business.
And it's not as simple as that.
But it's not. But I think it points to something larger, which is the scale of intervention, and that as you know, as great as it is for organizations to become more capabilities-led, to be more explorative in terms of how they can support artists in this field, etc., unless there is kind of a higher level overhaul of how the cultural sector is seen to contribute to society, how its value is measured and appreciated or not, etc. Like none of this can really happen. So
yes, and it's sort of avoiding that situation where it's like on the onus of each individual organisation to sort of
figure it out for
happen.
themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you for those questions. Apologies if some of them weren't answered properly, but I'm sorry.
But we do have an option for that.
Oh, we do have an option for that. If we haven't had time to get to your question, please get in touch with us on our email. Our address is fae, F-A-E, @serpentinegalleries.org, and we'd be more than happy to have a discussion, especially once we've had a little bit of time to digest some of the questions that you've asked. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have reached the end of our time. So to end, we're just going to say thank you to everyone for being here. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone who's contributed to Fae 2. Thank you to the Arts Technologies team. Thank you to Ralph. Thank you to Florence. Thank you to Sarah. And we're going to go and have a little celebration.
Bye.
Bye.